I'm going to introduce Dr. May Carskadon, who is our first speaker. And she is the head of the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior in the Alpert Medical School of Brown University in Providence, USA. She is going to talk about sleep in adolescents. Please join me to welcome Dr. May Carskadon.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias to the committee who put the program together, and to Oscar. It's a delight to be here. I also want to congratulate the Mexican Sleep Society on the 10th anniversary, a great accomplishment with many more great accomplishments to come, I'm sure. This morning, I will tell you about sleep in adolescents, and let me sort of begin with a brief outline of what I'll be talking about. So first, most of you are probably familiar with adolescent sleep behavior, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the data about when adolescents are sleeping. Then I'm going to go into the biology and what we know about how sleep regulation is changing during adolescent development, and a few other factors, again, that are outside of the biology, but which as humans we pay attention to, that change how biology might place sleep. And then talk a little bit about why we should care, and how sleep does play a role in learning and academics. And I don't really have much to say on interventions, but we may touch on that in the question time. So in broad strokes, what we know about sleep in adolescents is that they will go to bed later. And in adolescents in North America, at any rate, they get up earlier, not because they want to, but because the schools insist that they do. And they therefore sleep less than they had when younger. I want to just show you quickly some data from North America. So these are students in the US, and we'll talk, so this is grade 6 through grade 12. And so the age range is about age 11 or 12 to age 17 or 18 years. So on school nights, bedtime is about 9:30, 21:30 almost, and gets later, just as we said, until here by grade 12, it's 2300. Waking up in the morning is pretty early, and gets a little earlier as the children age. And what's important to notice is the number of hours slept. So you see the number of hours slept getting less and less until around 7 hours on average in 11th and 12th grade. On weekends, we see a little bit more of the biology coming through, so bedtimes go later. Wake-up times also go later, and hours slept are greater than on school nights. I want to share a little bit of data from studies or from a study in South Korea looking at sleep in similar age groups. So here we see on school nights, bedtime starts much later in grades 5 and 6 than we saw in the 6th graders in North America, and gets later and later, and nearly 1 a.m. by grades 11 and 12. Rise time gets earlier as well, and hours slept, while similar in the younger grades to the US, are much, much less in the older grades in South Korea. And this is in part because in South Korea, the bedtimes are so late because children go to school in the morning, they do their schooling, they come home from school, they study, and then they go to school again at night and stay at school for many, many hours. So there's a lot of academic pressure. And this is South Korea, but it's also in other countries in Asia where that pattern is there. And so sleep is very short in these young people. Well, you may be asking yourself, so how much sleep do adolescents really need? And I can't give you a single number, but we can talk a little bit about findings that bear on this issue. So one way to look at it is, well, at what age and at how much sleep do we see a difference between the amount of sleep children take on weekdays, where school is a constraint, versus weekends, where they have no such constraints. And in a couple of studies, one in North America and one in Iceland, we see that about age 10, and with about 10 hours of time asleep, it's equal on school days and weekends. But as kids get older, they sleep less on school days and have a bounce back, oversleep on the weekends. So you think, well, 10 hours, maybe that's the golden amount of sleep, or the need for sleep. In another study that we did, we actually thought, well, we'll see the need for sleep decline with age as we study children and put them at 10 hours of sleep at night, and then study them again every year. And what we saw was that no, the amount of sleep did not decline. It was always about 9 hours and 20 minutes, and this was between age 10 and age 17. So this is the actual amount of sleep recorded by polygraph. In another study, we thought, well, what if we give them as much sleep as we think they can take? What will happen? In this study, we had long nights, 18-hour nights, and we had the children, in bed trying to sleep that entire time. And the amount of sleep over several days leveled off at about 10 hours. So these were adolescents ages 12 to 16 or 17. So if you put all this together, you can think, well, maybe the average adolescent from ages 10 through 17 or 18 needs 9 or 9.5 hours of sleep. And so what we see then is a discrepancy between the amount we think adolescents need to sleep and the amount they actually obtain. And here's where they get into trouble. Well, let's talk about some of the factors that are involved in this discrepancy. First, I'll spend most of the time talking about these developmental changes in sleep regulation. So we'll talk about the circadian timing system and sleep-wake homeostasis. And then a little bit on the changing psychosocial context for adolescents, the role of parents in schools, and then we'll wrap up. So we'll start with the two-process model of sleep as our fundamental way of thinking about how sleep is regulated. And these two processes, one is process S, or the sleep pressure system. So the propensity to sleep gets greater as we stay awake longer. And when we sleep, we dissipate that sleep pressure. And the circadian timing system shows that the pressure to sleep varies as a function of the internal clock. So these two factors are important, and we see in other species they play a very core role, and they'll play a role in our sleep, but humans are very good at making other priorities for our sleep than our biology. And during adolescent development, we see that certainly is going to play a role. So what is happening to the circadian timing system during adolescence? We'll talk about several pieces of evidence. We'll talk about circadian phase, so what time the clock is set at. We'll talk about the response to light, We'll talk about the intrinsic period, so the internal day length, and then the amplitude of the circadian signal, and how these seem to change during adolescent development. First, I want to just sort of make a point that what we see in human adolescents has also been reflected in a number of studies of non-human juvenile mammals. Megan Hagenauer, she's an example of the Homo sapiens, but she is also the graduate student who wrote a lovely review and really dug into the literature to find these studies in non-human mammals that reflect this juvenile phase delay. Not many people study this, and so it was an important effort on her behalf. I also, just another picture, this is the fat sand rat. I won't be talking about the fat sand rat, but everybody always wonders, what does a fat sand rat look like? So now you know. So the first piece we want to talk about is phase. And one of the ways to understand circadian phase is to look at chronotype, or the construct of morningness, eveningness. Chronotype, as defined by Till Roenberg, and this is, if you're interested in this is a very nice paper that he put together with a lot of data. And what he does is ask people, on your free nights, when you have, like weekends, you have no school, no work, nothing to interfere with your sleep, when do you go to sleep, and when do you wake up? And his measure then is the midpoint of sleep, so the middle of the night. And that's plotted on this axis. So this would be an early midpoint. Here's 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m. And he's asked this question of many hundreds of people in Europe. And what's important for us here today is this part of the graph, looking at about age 10 to the early 20s, so across the second decade of adolescence. And if you look at this and sort of think about it for a minute, you kind of get the point of this, and actually the title of this paper was A Biological Marker for the End of Adolescence. And of course, the marker being this inflection point here. So during this decade, children move later and later on this chronotype measure. And in the early 20s and throughout adulthood, we march earlier and earlier on that marker. So this is a very strong piece of evidence that something is going on that is pushing the sleep well beyond the middle of the night, certainly. Well, nobody's at the middle of darkness, which is midnight. All humans, pretty much all humans, are later than that. But certainly during adolescent development, there is this rapid switch to later timing. We've looked at this in the laboratory using different measures, and here we use the onset time for melatonin production. So you've probably heard of this as the dim light melatonin onset phase. And here, Tanner stage is a measure of pubertal development based on secondary sexual characteristics. So when you see Tanner stage 1, that's prepubertal childlike appearance. And as we go into higher, there are benchmarks that are hit on breast development, pubic hair growth, and so forth. And by Tanner stage 5, the appearance is fully adult. And so if we look at this graph, what we see, so not only is the timing when we do our sleep, or our preference for when we sleep, changing, but the rhythm phase is set at a later time. So all of these individuals were on exactly the same schedule for several weeks before we did this measure. And you can see that there's a very strong association of maturational phase and the timing of this circadian marker. In another species, here the macaque, there's interesting data from Marigallo, and what she sees in her female monkeys, where they know almost to the day, certainly to the week or month, when the onset of menarche is in these female monkeys. She sees a delay in the timing of bedtime, basically, so activity offset in these animals. And she shows that it's associated with pubertal onset, and one way she shows it is by inhibiting puberty, by changing the animal's diet. And when she does that, they no longer show this big phase delay. So again, making the point that there seems to be some fundamental biology here in this adolescent delay in circadian timing. So there's another example. This is the Octodon daegu. These are probably the cutest rodents I've ever met. They're very friendly. Although I had someone who met my pet daegu and then went to work in a lab that had daegus. Lab daegus aren't as friendly. His hand showed a scar of that. At any rate, in these animals, at the onset of puberty, again, there's a delay in phase. And here, it's the time that sleep ends, the onset of activity, as opposed to the offset of activity in the monkeys. So again, human, monkey, and rodent, we see a similar pattern. Well, let's look a little bit about what else might be going on. And the first thing, when we think especially about the humans, is this change in light exposure. So the circadian timing system is sensitive to light in a phase-specific manner. And so if we get light in the early part of our nighttime, it will push us later. If we get light in the morning, it will pull us earlier. And usually we maintain a balance. So if you think about it then, staying up later, which many adolescents do, and they'll do it nowadays in front of a computer screen or a laptop or a television set, they'll have more light later in the day, which is pushing them later. The other thing they often do as well is wake up later or make their bedroom a cave so they don't get morning light. So they won't have that signal in the morning to help pull them earlier and anchor their circadian timing system. We can also think about other things that can happen. Does the circadian system change in a way that makes them more or less sensitive to this phase-dependent light signal in morning or evening? So you would think, okay, if during adolescence we become more sensitive to evening light, that can push for a later phase. Or, on the other hand, if we become less sensitive to morning light, that would prevent the phase advance that morning light gives us. So there's not a lot of data on this. There's one study that was done in mice that were pubertal mice. So these were female mice. And this is the phase response curve to light. So this is time going here. And this is the nighttime. This is the daytime. So not much happens when you show light in the daytime. These are phase shifts in the delay, so later direction, phase shifts in the advanced direction. And what you see very clearly here, these are adult mice, so you see what you would expect. Light at night, in the early part of the night, pushes later. But look at these pubertal mice, so P49, so they're juvenile mice, show an exaggeration of this phase delay. So a little bit of evidence that, maybe something is happening to the light sensitivity during juvenile development. We also wonder whether intrinsic period, so the internal day length, might change during adolescent development. So it might be longer during adolescence and shorter as we go into adulthood. And if this is a model of what would happen if you have longer periods, it's associated with later phase due to the way things line up on this phase response curve. So we have some data from our lab showing that, so this is the number of adolescents, and this is circadian period. Here would be 24 hours, and this would be a clock time that's longer than 24 hours, and here shorter than 24 hours. So this is data from adults, and all of these participants have been studied in forced desynchrony. So adults, you can see in the dark colors, are a little more towards the left. More of them are shorter than 24 hours. In the adolescents, you can see more of them shifted here to longer intrinsic periods. So again, if period is longer, phase is later. So we see, again, where this biology may impact on what's going on. Final dimension we looked at is the amplitude of the circadian rhythm. And in one study, we were able to compile data from many adolescents, and again, here by Tanner stage. Remember, Tanner 1 is childlike, prepubescent. Tanner 5 is adult-like. So these are just showing the melatonin curves at each of these maturational states. And you can see clearly the amplitude is much lower at the mature than the prepubertal level. So this is one marker of the circadian rhythm that seems to show a change in amplitude. So just to summarize then what we see during adolescent development of the circadian rhythm system, we see that timing changes. So there's a delay that occurs in adolescence, and we see that in phase preference or chronotype, and we see it in the melatonin phase. We saw that light sensitivity may change in the pubertal mouse. We saw that circadian period, which also affects phase, may be longer in adolescents than adults. And we see a reduced amplitude of the circadian clock, and that may dampen the signal for sleep, which again would make it easier to stay awake later. So we put all this together, late nights are favored as are late mornings. So let's set that to one side and now look at the sleep-wake homeostasis system and how it changes during adolescent development. So again, you'll remember this system, and it's based on looking mostly at the delta waves or slow wave sleep. And just a reminder that what we look at is the buildup of this process S and the decline or the recovery across sleep. So we can look at then slow wave sleep stages are a qualitative measure, and most of you have seen, and probably a lot of you have measured and counted slow wave sleep. We can also do quantitative analysis of the EEG and look at slow wave activity. And then another way we looked at this is the sleep propensity, the speed of falling asleep. If we look grossly at the sleep of adolescents, we see big changes, big differences. So this is a plot of the same child recorded 2 years apart. So here when she was Tanner stage 1 and 12 years old, and a little more than 2 years later when she was Tanner 5 at 14 and a half years old. In the light gray, you see our usual hypnogram of sleep. And in the dark, you see the quantitative analysis of the slow wave activity. So when we look then at what happens during adolescent development, you see very clearly that the amount of this deep slow wave sleep early in the night declines. And across adolescent development, that decline is about 40%. So it's a pretty huge change happening very rapidly. We also see a decline in the strength of the slow wave activity. So you can see these big mountains, if you will, of slow wave activity in the prepubertal slide. And here, postpubertal, see how much lower this is. But it looks like the pattern across the night is similar. And that's really the question. So we see these phenomenological changes, but do they reflect a change in how sleep is regulated? So I have Oscar Yenny and Peter Ackerman to thank for these data, where they took data from a number of children who were studied at Tanner stage 1 or 2, so pre or early pubertal, and at post-pubertal ages, and did computational analyses of baseline sleep and recovery sleep to derive metrics for the process of this decay across sleep and the buildup across waking. And what the conclusion of this analysis was that the decay rate, which is shown by this value here, the decay time constant, it doesn't change, was the same in both the pre- and post-pubertal children. By contrast, however, the rise time constant, which is a marker of, or a metric for the speed with which the buildup occurs, was slower in the post-pubertal adolescents than in the pre- and early pubertal adolescents. So the decay rate is the same, and that comes back to this issue of sleep need. So the recovery process is the same, but the build-up process changes. Let's look now at sleep propensity. So here, using the multiple sleep latency test for many hours in Tanner 1 prepubertal and postpubertal participants. And we see that the groups divide here after being awake 14 and a half, 16 and a half hours. So remember, the MSLT is please lie quietly and try to fall asleep. So it's not easy for them to fall asleep in the daytime, but as we get more and more hours awake, you can see the prepubertal children falling asleep easier than the postpubertal. And then we get out even further and nobody can stay awake. So this Monique Lebergeois and Oscar Yaney, that's Monique there, put together this model. They've been looking at even younger children. And what we think is part of what's changing maturationally in the sleep process S system is this buildup of sleep pressure across wakefulness. And so here, the fastest buildup is in 2-year-olds. And that makes sense if you think about 2-year-olds, that they are taking naps because they have to, because sleep pressure is building so fast. And then here we see our 10-year-olds and our 15-year-olds. So we see the sleep pressure buildup getting a bit slower as people mature. So in summary then, for process S, the recovery process doesn't change. So that may reflect this issue that the need for sleep doesn't change. But the accumulation of sleep pressure slows. And again, we can interpret that as making it easier to stay awake longer. So again, the result is that late nights are easier to achieve, but the same amount of sleep is needed. So moving now outside of biology into the more psychosocial context, we see a lot of things that are going on, and if I asked everyone in the room, each of you could name yet another factor that's changing developmentally in adolescents that could reflect back on their sleep system. One that comes out pretty early, at least in our North American cohorts, is this exertion of autonomy. So wanting to become their own person. And a place where it seems children start pretty early on is with bedtime. I'm older, I want to stay up later. So, and then parents of course say, if you eat your broccoli or whatever it is the children don't like, you can stay awake later. Some of the kids will have jobs as they get older, so that can feed back on sleep. Starting to use substances. And by substances, it's anything from caffeine on to, taking their friends' stimulants that their friend is getting for treating their ADHD. Screen time at night is going to get longer. Social networking at night, so not only being in front of the screen, but connecting with someone. Another facet of social networking are these first new loves gained or new loves lost, which affect the ability to fall asleep. And as we say, we could go on and on and on. So all of these things are working hand in glove with the biology to change sleep and sleep opportunity. I just wanted to highlight one of these. So this is an issue that is becoming more important as we move deeper into the 21st century. This is a paper by Kane and this is Michael Gradisar. And they were laying out, well, we see that sleep may change, but why? And so one mechanism might be that using media at night just takes the place of sleep. But there may be other things going on. So it may be more arousing and then make it difficult to fall asleep. So affecting sleep sort of as a secondary process. And the third possibility is it may affect sleep through the circadian timing system by exposing the clock to light in the phase delay position. So I heard a recent talk by Professor Gradisar where his data from his lab isn't really supporting any of these mechanisms yet. So there's work to be done still. One of the things up north that affects adolescent sleep is the school starting time, which is largely driven by the school busing system. So the older a student is, the earlier the school starts. And school time regulates pretty much when kids have to get up. So I wanted to tell you just about one study, and this was, I found, just amazing when we saw this. So these were kids who in 10th grade had to be at school at 7:20 in the morning. And we put actigraphs on them and had them just keep their own schedule, and then come into the lab on a Friday night and Saturday, and we put them on their same schedule they'd been keeping. So overall, they were getting about 7 hours of sleep a night. And when we brought them into the lab and measured their sleep propensity with the sleep latency test, we saw this very sleepy pattern, and especially early in the morning. Well, actually, 8:30 wasn't very early in the morning compared to when they had to be in school. But what was more disturbing to me was when we looked at what kind of sleep they had, we saw these REM sleep onsets in half of the children, more often in that 8:30 nap. I know there are clinicians in the group, so you're thinking, oh, falling asleep fast, going directly into REM sleep, you have a population of people with narcolepsy. Well, no, there wasn't an epidemic of narcolepsy in these children, What there was an epidemic of having to wake up at the wrong circadian phase. So if we look at the time of this melatonin onset phase, in those who did not have REM sleep onsets and those who did, we can see that the phase is later in the children who had REM sleep onsets. So they're actually waking up at an earlier time on their circadian timing system, the time when the brain is programmed us to be in REM sleep. So they're not only very sleepy, but their brains pretty much are, on their pillow at home, not in their classroom at school. So when we think about the consequences of these three factors and how they interact, we see that sleep timing becomes quite variable. And again, Till Roenberg has given us a term for this, social jet lag. And he's related this social jet lag now to a number of sort of negative outcomes, mostly in adults though. So type 2 diabetes, obesity, and now I believe there's some evidence for cardiovascular disease being greater in people who have greater social jet lag. So their sleep is very different on weekends than on weekdays. The adolescents also are getting chronically insufficient sleep, and that results in mood problems, learning problems, problems with impulse control and behavior regulation, as well as excessive sleepiness. So let's spend just a couple minutes on this issue of sleepiness and these sleep problems and achievement and learning. Because adolescence is a time, a prime time, to be learning and gaining skills. Preparatorio, I think, is what you call your high schools down here. So first, just sort of, this is a little bit of a sidelight, but during sleep, we found that there's a correlation between the coherence of the sleeping EEG waves and improvement on several types of cognitive tests. So sleep, it's related. Is it causing? Is it helping improve? We don't know, but there certainly seem to be some parallels there between what's happening in sleep and what's happening with learning. But we also know, and I think we're all familiar with this, that sleep prepares the child for learning. If they don't have enough sleep, they're going to be sleepy, distracted, irritable, they're not going to be motivated, and they'll be inattentive. And so you can't bring in information, you can't acquire information if you're suffering from all of those things. So the processing of input is impaired with too little sleep. On the other side, the retrieval of information that's been learned is impaired by exactly those same factors when there's too little sleep. So your ability of the child to access the learned information is disrupted. But now we also know that sleep does something between this acquisition phase and the retrieval phase. So as we sleep, we also are consolidating, stabilizing, and strengthening what we've learned the day before, and filtering it as well. And it's interesting, with insufficient sleep, you filter in more of the bad things you learned, the emotionally negative things you learned during the day, than when you have plenty of sleep. So not getting enough sleep is a problem. So I'm going to put this together for you. This is a busy slide, but it's kind of my way of thinking of this, and I call it the perfect storm. So our pre-adolescent has the perfect sleep. So they get plenty of sleep. It's at the time when they're supposed to be sleeping, according to their biology. But as they enter, into adolescence, which is everything down here, we see their circadian rhythms push later. The sleep pressure system makes it easier to stay awake later. So it's pushing for later timing of sleep. And many of these psychosocial factors, bedtime autonomy, homework, social networking, also push later. Now, everything would be just fine if this could happen on both ends of the scale. So, sleeping later, great. But what happens is that social pressures push for an earlier rise time. So whether it's getting up for sport, in New England, that's getting on the ice for hockey. Often the ice time is hard to get. Or, as I already reviewed, the school start time, or it could be getting up early to go to work, any number of things that make it impossible to delay the rise time. So they're going to bed late, they're waking up early, have long days, short sleep. And then we have this added weekend sleep delay and the social jet lag that ensues. So at the end of the day, so to speak, these adolescents are, many of them have too little sleep, they're unhappy, they're more prone to be sick physically, and they're not learning or maturing cognitively as well as they might. So I will thank you very much for your attention.
Bueno, ¿se oye? Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And this is open for discussion. Any questions, comments? Mónica, please. Sí. Are you getting translate? Are you getting? Yes? Okay.
Sí, me queda claro que no deberíamos presionar a nuestros adolescentes a que se duerman temprano, a que atiendan sus actividades muy temprano por la mañana, sino dejarlos que tengan su fase atrasada, ¿no? Hacia el dormir. Y me parece que este sistema está muy preservado y se ha conservado evolutivamente, pero no me queda claro qué sentido tendría si al final tenemos un adolescente que está rindiendo mal en la escuela, que no ejecuta bien, que no recuerda, etcétera, ¿no? Y no sé si nos podría decir qué sentido tiene que sean así nuestros adolescentes.
Are you asking me to speak in evolutionary terms?
Yeah.
Well, one, sleep does not leave a fossil record, so we don't know much about the evolution. I can tell, I recently was at a meeting with Irene Tobler, who has studied many species of animals and has thought a lot about the evolution of sleep. And she reminded me of the main role of evolution, which is preservation of the species, which means it comes down to reproduction. So let's go back then to human evolution. And one of the things that we can think about is smaller society, right? Later puberty, later development in age. So children nowadays are entering puberty at age 10 or 11, but we know even historically in the last 100 years, 100 years, 120 years ago, puberty started at age 15 or 16. So think back evolutionary times, it was probably more likely later. Okay, so again, this is a story. So you have communities where I don't know, think of cave dwellers or whatever. But one of the things I think about are a temporal niche, a timing where different members of the community are awake and congregating with one another or protecting the community, vigilant to protect the community. And so if we see older people going earlier and rising early in the morning, that may be part of the temporal niche that they engage in. And as children go into adolescence, they take a different temporal niche, but it also means that at the prime reproductive age, they are sort of get that autonomy and meet with conspecifics at a time when that can happen. So, I mean, that, again, it's a story. And I guess, you know, in modern times, we're actually now seeing a little bit of that. You know, a lot of the social networking now is in adolescence is happening late at night. So it's sort of the coming back to that reproductive pressure, maybe. But, you know, that aside, the other part of your question was, should we do something to just let them do what they want, or what their brains want, or should we be forcing them into another role? And I think that we can be somewhere in between. And I think part of it is education of the children themselves, of teachers and parents and school directors and bus drivers, everyone, you know, that this is happening. But there are ways to help make it easier and to come in between. And so if we enhance the light for children in the morning, that will make it easier. If we diminish the light and other arousing stimuli at night for children, that will make it easier. Both of those would help them go to sleep a little bit earlier, if they buy into it. And that's where the education comes in. And so, you know, I think, and then in North America, we're trying to have a little bit of change, at least in the school starting times, and not have 7:20 be a school starting time, but have 8:30 be a school starting time. So parents need to help sort of set limits and help their children and set bedtimes. I mean, parents have kind of stopped setting bedtimes once kids are over, you know, age 4 or 5, it seems. So reestablishing a parental role will help the kids do a better job, and the kids themselves learning, oh, if I drink caffeine, you know, at 6 p.m., my sleep is going to be, or if I take a nap at 6 p.m., I can't go to bed and fall asleep at 10 p.m. And so, you know, on and on and on. There are ways that we can change behavior on an individual basis. But that school start time issue in North America is important because it allows everyone's behavior to be changed simultaneously. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Any other questions, please? Please, there.
Muchas gracias, doctora. Bueno, antes que nada, admiro y respeto mucho su trabajo.
Could you start over?
No.
Personally, I admire and respect your work. You inspire mine. Thank you for your excellent presentation. And I have one question for you. When we compare, I work with teenagers, and when we compare those who assist in the morning to school and those who assist in afternoon with school start time 2 o'clock, we found a different sleep pattern. In the morning, students, we found a similar pattern than yours. They have reduced sleep time in school days, and they compensate on weekends. But when we compare with the students who assist in the afternoon, we found this pattern at the other side. They tend to compensate their sleep in school days, and they have short sleep on weekend days. Why do you think that this phenomenon could happen?
Well, I think it fits very well. I think probably the second group gets to have more fun on the weekends. Because they have enough sleep most of the week. And I guess, so their social jet lag is opposite from the other children. But most of the time they're in their sort of natural, what their biology would favor. So you would see, I would think that would be a healthier circumstance. If you added up their sleep across a week, do the children who have the later time get more sleep? Yeah, so overall, and have you looked at achievement in school?
It's really bad in both groups.
Oh, well, we need to talk to the teachers then.
So in that context, have you seen a difference in the so-called in America gifted kids, adolescents, gifted adolescents?
Well, I think children who are advantaged by, being gifted either cognitively or on a socioeconomic platform, they are protected, and so they have greater resilience in terms of their academic function. And there was a wonderful paper done that was published in a journal like Psychological Economics or something like that talked clearly about the cost and expense and the gains that were made. And he looked very carefully at the testing that was done, and the improvements when school start time was later were most evident in the children who were at the lower end of the cognitive and socioeconomic scale. So they got a big boost. And the kids who were doing well were still doing well. So there is, I think, some children have buffers to the system but what's not buffered as well is their mood. And so depression is a big problem, regardless of socioeconomic status or cognitive ability. And I think, when we think about what's going on with these, we can't just think of academic achievement, but I think a lot of adolescents, and we see this in the Korean adolescents, where suicide rates are just skyrocketing. And so, I think that's another factor we really need to keep in mind.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Please, go ahead.
Thank you again. Doctor, for example, in our group who assist in the morning, we have found that they live really far away from school, and they transport about 3 hours. They are really with a big somnolence day, and in the afternoon, they used to take naps about 3 or 4 hours. Is this normal, or what do you think about?
I think it's necessary. So if your early group has to be awake and traveling 3 hours. So yesterday, I had to wake up at 3:30 to catch my first flight to get here. I didn't take that 4-hour nap. I could have. I put off the nap and went to bed very early. So I think, sleep, if you build sleep pressure up like that, and if they're only sleeping, 5 or 6 of those 9 or so hours they need, they have to sleep sometime. So it really puts them in a very challenging situation to get enough sleep and still do what the grown-ups want them to do.
One last question, please. Doctor.
That was an excellent talk. Thank you. I have as a parent, I have twin boys who are 9 years old in 3rd grade, and at the school where they attend, I think in 5th grade they go from 8:30 start time to 8, and personally I'm looking forward to that. So I guess my point here is, how do you know parents are not driving the school hours? Now clearly 7:20 a.m. is out of the norm, even for the United States. But is it possible that parents are not in agreement? Because if we want to change school hours, don't we have to change parental hours of work?
Changing the school start time is a huge issue. The schools are the times are regulated within each community or district. The schools are often the heart of the community, at least the community of families with children. And the school districts that have made the changes have worked very hard to make it work for families. So I'm sort of reading your mind. You want them to go to school earlier because you want to be at work earlier. Yes. And so regardless of what it does to their poor little brains, it helps Daddy. And Daddy, you're on the other end of that circadian period plot. Your boys actually 10 years old is the perfect age. I love 10-year-olds, so you're about to hit that perfect age. But they need to be sleeping, and they should be sleeping every single night. They should be getting plenty of sleep. And and so if you now say, oh well, they only have to get up a half hour earlier, but now their biology is changing, and it's going to be harder for them to get that amount of sleep they need. And so then they're going to oversleep on the weekends, and now you start getting deeper and deeper into social jet lag world. And your children, are probably at the top of the pile in terms of what we talked about with resilience and support and so forth. So your children may not suffer as much as maybe some of the other children in their school. So when you say are parents driving, I've been to so many communities and so many school districts struggling with this issue, and parents are like this. And so some of the parents want to change, some of the parents don't want to change. Some of them, raise all these issues. The system has a lot of inertia in it. And at the end of the day, the places that make the healthy change put a lot of effort into it and do things like build in programs in the morning for parents who need to drop their children off early, or build in program in the afternoon that protect those younger children who used to go home to their older siblings being there with daycare, now allowing older siblings to pick them up from the after-school events. So, every community makes its choices. But I talked to a newspaper reporter the day before yesterday who was calling from Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where the school start time has been changed from 8 o'clock to 7:30. I was shocked. It goes against all of the biology, all of the experts, and it's just, hello, in 2013, school districts are making the wrong move. So it's a challenge.
Well, I'm sorry, but I know there are a lot of questions, but I have to stop it because we have to move on, and because Dr. Carskadon has to go to the airport. Thank you very much, and on behalf of the...
Again, thank you all so much. This was really fun.
Please consider this your presence from the society.